the Journal of Petroleum Technology, or JPT. I hope everyone tuning in today is being safe and healthy. Today we're trying something new. We're doing a live chat with editors from JPT and the oil and gas facilities, two of SPE's four main publications. We're going to be spending the next half hour or so with you, highlighting some of the most recent reports that are in OGF and JPT. And we're going to give you also a preview of some of the things that we're working on in the next couple of weeks. We're going to touch on OPEC Plus agreement, which is sort of the big topic of the day and its potential impacts. Brian Balboa, an editor with Oil and Gas Facilities, is going to talk to us about what the industry has in terms of cost cutting, if there's any more room to go. Judy Federer is going to give us a high-level view of the offshore arena, and Stephen Rassenfoss is going to end us with a spotlight on 3 new drilling innovations that might help that segment of the market. So first, we're gonna just dive into the OPEC Plus agreement and get some of those highlights out of the way. This agreement sort of became formalized on Sunday. It's a historic deal. It's the largest agreement. It's the largest cuts that OPEC Plus has ever made, and it ends a costly price war that, as we know, began early March and has resulted in a lot of chaos in the oil and gas industry. So the things to keep in mind with this cut is that it's 9.7 million barrels a day. The cuts do not take place until May 1st. And the baseline for the largest 2 members of OPEC Plus, Russia and Saudi Arabia, they're going to start their cuts at 11 million barrels a day, which is significant since Saudi Arabia especially is already producing over 12 million. Both will go down to 8.5 million a day. And these cuts, though, this 9.7, this does not last for long. They're going to loosen up in June and shrink to 5.8 million barrels a day until December, and those will translate into further cuts that go down to 5.8 million in January 21 to 22. Mexico created a little bit of drama here, holding up the agreement. This was sort of what added a little bit of a twist to the overall deal. They were asked to make a cut of 400,000 barrels a day, but they only agreed to 100,000 barrel a day cut, and said that the U.S. was going to pick up the slack there on 250,000. So the mechanisms in place for the United States to join this are not clear yet, but that's what got the deal through in the end. The big question, though, is will it make a difference? The EIA had a report out today stating that April's demand is now 24 to 29 million barrels a day off from year-over-year levels. So it's only a dent. And what we've seen is that the crude markets, WTI and Brent, have not responded too favorably. But what analysts think is that this will stem the bleeding over the long term. So obviously these cuts are going to be a big story and something for us to keep an eye on. And we're gonna be covering that story a little bit more as it develops in JPT. But I want to throw it over to Brian now. He's been looking at the cost cutting that the industry has been going through. This has been another huge story. Brian Balboa is the associate editor of our online publication, Oil and Gas Facilities. Brian, you've been covering projects and investments in the upstream world. What has stood out to you the most during this period?
So, Trent, what really stands out right now is how little companies have to work with when it comes to reducing costs. Now, when you look at the last downturn that took place from 2014, 2016, companies were forced to reduce costs and streamline operations across the board. Now, since then, most of the industry has actually kept those cost-cutting measures in place. So, they're operating lean as it was coming into this pandemic, so to speak. That's made it even more difficult for companies to cut costs this time around. So I wrote a feature last week on OGF where energy research groups Wood Mackenzie and Rystad Energy actually outlined this very issue. Looks like your mic is cut there, but let me dive into that right there. So some areas, Trent, that Wood Mac and Rystad think that are most likely to be cut. Obviously no area is safe right now. In the case of Wood Mac, the areas that are the easiest to cut right now are going to be the short cycle investment for the lower 48 states. You can see the chart right there. and pre-final investment decision projects. Now, the easiest way to actually cut CapEx spending right now, according to WoodMac experts, is really not to spend and to defer. So WoodMac, they actually lowered their 2020 global CapEx estimate from just under 500 billion to under 400 billion. But again, you have to note with the wide range of uncertainty right now, risk is very much still to the downside. When you look at Rystad's analysis on global E&P, global exploration and production, they said operators will only be able to cut supply chain costs by up to 12% this year. So about 9% of those cuts relate to service prices and 3% to efficiency improvements. You can see the screen up here too. They expect similar cuts within the shale industry at 16%, similar cuts offshore at 12%, and other onshore at 10%. Now, looking at that, I mean, they're still able to cut costs, but it's really not a lot compared to the previous downturn in 2015, 2016, when the industry saw a reduction of 37%, as outlined there. The shale industry back then, in particular, was able to reduce costs by nearly half back then at 45%. So really not a lot of room to trim fat, as they say.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Brian. Still getting used to the mute button here, but yeah, no, good point. I mean, I think what that says to me is it shows that really the industry hadn't fully recovered from the last downturn in 14 and 15, and so this is going to come with an extra sting. What are some of the other things that you're looking at right now and have coming out in the near term?
So right now, I'm actually looking at storage space. There's really not a lot of storage space out there. I mean, you have overabundance of supply, weak demand. We've seen how oil prices have actually crashed at a record pace. I mean, you just talked about that with the OPEC Plus story. But kind of on a positive note, though, one thing I'm working at right now that I'm looking at is a white paper that came out of the University of Houston. And we've seen how hard this has hit the oil and gas industry in terms of job cuts, hiring freezes, and work furloughs. But a recent study out of U of H and two energy associations found that a majority of workers in the energy sector actually approve of how their employers are handling the challenges brought on by COVID-19. I've had a chance to look at the survey. I've had a look at it. It covers a lot of ground, and almost 90% of the employees that were surveyed said their companies have responded to the pandemic effectively based on 3 issues. Number one being whether the company provided clear and honest information about the issue. Number 2, whether they provided support to help workers juggle work responsibilities along with family responsibilities. And number 3, the extent to which the company has actually been prepared for the prospect of a global viral pandemic. I mean, most of the world is actually working from home. A lot of the world, actually. I mean, I'm juggling work responsibilities here, not just family responsibilities as well. So it's something that, I can definitely identify with. I'm sure a lot of people that are on this webinar can identify with as well. So, I mean, looking at it, employees also indicated, though, in the survey that their companies must invest even more in employee health and well-being should this continue to grow. And again, they feel that companies should be growing projects to support these local communities as well. So even though companies are having a tough go at it with budget cuts and job cuts, employees do feel that their companies are doing what they can. So that story will be out sometime this week on OGF.
Okay, well, thank you, Brian, for that update. We're going to move to Judy Federer, who's the JPT Technology Editor. Judy, you with us?
Yes. Hi, Trent.
Hey, Judy.
First, apologies for scratchy voice and any coughing. I do not have coronavirus, but nice weather in Houston brings with it allergies. So
that's the new normal. Now we have to apologize for having allergies. But no, I'm with you there. So you've been looking at the offshore arena the last few months. And what are some of the shifts in those scenarios that you've been looking at?
Well, I started working in late February on an article that will appear in the May issue of JPT. And when I started making notes, the offshore industry was doing everything right and really starting to look up. Two 2019 had been the third best year on record for the offshore. It dominated the highest volume of new discoveries since 2015. Free cash flow was approaching $90 billion, and break-evens for pre-FID deepwater projects were averaging $50 a barrel. There also at that time was anticipated $60 billion of greenfield commitments with break-evens of less than $40 a barrel. So everything was really looking good. Then all of a sudden, in a period of a few days in March, the whole world changed, and with it the offshore picture. So now, basically, it's moved to survival mode. Everything is down, obviously. Expectations from analysts are that seismic market will decline about 60%. We'll probably end up with about 22 floating rigs, and the 8 majors that make up 3/4 of deep water operations are cutting costs anywhere from 20 to 30%. Within that, all regions will be hard hit, probably Africa the hardest for a number of reasons, partially because their break-evens are $45 and often $60 a barrel.
So is there a bright spot in the offshore arena right now?
Yeah, actually there is, and in fact, some of the things that helped the offshore get into a good position for 2019 are helping them now. A lot of the operators cut their costs as much as 50%, and so I think they're able to work much leaner. Let's see, we're looking right here. Yeah, the other thing is cutoff points for production becoming unprofitable show, as you can see in this chart, that offshore is not in such bad shape. For Saudi Arabia conventional oil, the cutoff point at which production becomes unprofitable is $4 a barrel, moves up to $9 for conventional onshore, $10 for shelf work, also $10 for Russia, $12 a barrel for global tight oil, $13 for deep water, and up to $28 for heavy oil. So not so bad.
So what it really shows is that OPEC is not the issue. It's the exploration costs that are going to take the big hit here.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's being hit. That's being hit the hardest: exploration, drilling, seismic, et cetera.
But you're also seeing some silver linings, right?
Yes. Yeah. For example, subsea tiebacks and phasing, which helped lower costs before, are going to help now. Guyana, despite so many cutbacks, ExxonMobil, which is cutting, I think, 30%, is not touching their Guyana operations. And then in Norway, so Guyana is break even at $30. The Johan Sverdrup field in Norway is break even at less than $20. And one of the reasons for that is Equinor's adoption of digitalization, which brought them $400 million of extra cash flow last year, and they're expecting more. This picture is showing, just came this morning, talking about Equinor's digital twin operations. And these are two guys that what you don't see is the screen. This is how they're operating the Johan Sverdrup with a digital twin. So digitalization, I think, is going to be a helper going forward, and part of a silver lining.
Well, thank you, Judy, for the offshore perspective. And the last editor we're going to talk to this morning is Steve Rassenfoss, our senior emerging technology editor. Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay at home. What I'm talking about this morning kind of goes back a ways, back when I used to shake hands with people, although I was worried about it at the time. And when I got to go to the drilling conference, it was one of the last SPE shows that happened before we all started working at home. And good times, actually. Remembering.
So you wrote about innovation. You went in there not looking at big market trends, but you went in there looking for innovative ideas. What did you find?
Well, what I found was 3 devices that solve problems. Actually, some problems I didn't quite know were important on drilling rigs. One of the first ones was one that is involved with, you think of drillers and they obviously it's important they drill well, they manage the crew well, but it turns out coding is a thing as well. That every time they enter a record of what they're doing in the daily drilling report, you've got to take that thing and that each of these items and match it up with one of more than like 100 codes. These codes vary from company to company or operator to operation. So it's a tough thing for the drillers to get this right. And actually they do a pretty good job, but when the data people who are trying to take these codes and use them to sort out what drillers really do and look for little slices of time to save, which, as was pointed out by Brian earlier, is really getting to be critical. That you get into situations where you're wanting to make sure that they're all right. And so the University of Texas Rapid program, which is looking for new ways to push drilling automation, came up with an artificial intelligence way to sort through what they're doing and create an advisor for the coding. It's kind of like when you're doing a Google search. And so as you type words, or as they type in the words of what they're doing, it quickly offers 3 suggested codes for it. And it turns out that when they compare the accuracy of what the machine offered and what drillers would have chosen, that the machines was right more than 90% of the time. And drillers are like in the 80s, which, considering there's all those codes, all those different codes, that's not bad, but the accuracy should help the people doing searches later. It doesn't involve a whole lot of work, and it probably isn't something that drillers are going to resist, because while they really care a lot about making decisions when, say, doing directional drilling, if coding is easier, that's fine. So I think it's an idea that has some potential there.
Yeah, and it marries up with other things that we've seen as this digital takeover happens. All the sort of back end wonkiness doesn't really translate well to the field. So user interface, user experience, these things are paramount when trying to get adoption out in the field. But what was your second big innovation that you found, or was it little?
Well, we'll see how it is. I mean, it is one. All of these things have probably impacts that ultimately are hard to judge, because what you're trying to do is to turn what they do what they do better in a way that you can get data that will maybe help you get a more realistic view of the world. And one way to do that is if you can look really well at the damage and measure really accurately the damage they have. That's really interesting, because more and more there's people with automated drilling programs that in theory are reducing damage, reducing what happened, inefficient drilling, but you don't really know what the reality check for that is. What does the drill bit look like when they pull it up after it's gotten dulled in the ground or beat up, broken? And that's another one of those things, rituals in the rigs most people never think about. This is done by the company representatives. They call them company men, and commonly, and they're going to be asked whenever this thing is pulled. Might be in the middle of the night, might be dark, it's usually is a time when they're very busy, and try to do a very detailed look at all the many teeth on this, look at breaks, degree of wear, a lot of percentage questions. I mean, it's a really long question. It could take hours, and they don't have hours. And because there's, those, when you're switching out drill bits, a lot's going on in the rig that the company man wants to know about. And what these guys have come up with, it's called a bit box. And instead of having a human do this. The box covers this thing. There's multiple cameras. They shoot a lot of pictures, creating what's going to be like a 3D image that can be graphically measured or digitally measured, sent off to the cloud, and that'll help them see what's going on. I mean, the competition now is shooting it with a program that uses a cell phone, and or mobile. As anybody who takes does pictures with their phone, quality can matter. Quality, lighting, angles, they're all very inconsistent. So they're hoping they can create a device that's durable and about as cheap as a porta potty, so that they think that people can afford them and put them on rigs in a regular way. And the ultimate value will be, what can you find out about drilling if you get this kind of data? We'll see how they and NOV do on this joint venture.
Yeah, I really like this innovation because it reminds me on the other side of how we've seen a lot of computer vision technology been brought in to take pictures of the drill cuttings on the shale shakers and decide sort of the stability of the borehole that way. And this is sort of taking that idea back to the drill bit, which is really interesting. And yeah, you can imagine this is like a highly subjective human practice of trying to assess the wear and tear on a PDC bit.
And customers are already interested in looking at what else can they stick inside to find out if it's going to work or not.
Okay, well, and you also look at flow meters, is that right?
Yeah, now here's a problem that is pretty widely recognized. I mean, what the flow in and out of wells is really important to make sure, to control for one thing, for well control, because if there's an influx of gas, that's going to change, and early warnings and accurate warnings are really important. And nowadays, there's a lot of fairly inexact devices being used. The most popular being these not immediately meters, but flow indicators. And a paddle just basically moves up and down based on how much fluid's flowing through it. They're pretty inaccurate. It's a fairly subjective measure. These things get stuck when the dirt all that drilling mud gets into the hinges. They're just, they're fairly notorious, but they're really hard to replace, because this is a place where you want something that's small and you want something that's durable. And the best, most accurate substitute has been the Coriolis meter. It's a good, scientifically sound concept, but these things, when you're running a lot of fluid with mud and cuttings in them, tend to have buildups on their walls. You start getting inaccurate results. They're pretty large and they're hard to fit on there, and drill crews oftentimes just don't like the fact that these things are kind of finicky, and so they've just never caught on as a regular thing. So an innovator at Norse, which is a Norwegian research center, is trying to create a device which is built on the same scientific concept, but it's something that was tough and it was used in the sand business. And here, instead of having, as you can see in this picture, which helps a lot, the stuff comes in, it flows in from the top and goes into that yellow thing, the gold colored thing in the middle, which is, if you looked at it, kind of like a water wheel. And as the fluid, and it's spinning, and that, because it's spinning, the fluid and the solids and all will be pushed out by centripetal force out to the walls of the device. While it's doing that, the force that they apply increases the torque on this spinning wheel. And by precisely measuring that torque, they can figure out what kind of fluid flow they have coming out. When it hits the walls of that thing, of the meter, the sound of that, they can tell kind of the mix. Are they getting more cuttings in? Is it getting heavier, heavier, lighter? It's going to flow down the side, so it doesn't tend to get gunked up and then flow out. And there are some other meters they can include that will give them further, more detailed information. At this point, it looks like a promising idea. Some pretty heavy duty people from the industry were asking them afterwards at the show, what's going to happen. They're going to do a joint industry project and hope to get it tested. Based on the conversation that started about it on LinkedIn, it sounds like there's a lot of interest, but like every other innovation, there's a lot of people who think there's things that are just, it's too big, it's too complex, they got a better idea. So we'll see what wins out over time.
Yeah, well, anybody who's looked at flow meter technology or that space for any given time knows that it's really an interesting world with high hurdles. You're competing with technologies, like you said, they're either sort of notoriously inaccurate or cumbersome or delicate. And even if you come up with a better mousetrap, it's really hard to displace those legacy flow meters. But no, thanks. Good reporting, Steve. Thanks for bringing those ideas up to us. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank Judy and Brian as well. And for everybody listening, we're going to end our editors roundtable here. We hope that you got something out of today's discussion. All of the reports, with the exception of some of the previews, are available online on JPT and oil and gas facilities. And if anybody tuned in late to this broadcast, we're going to be making this available on whatever social media platform you're using right now to watch. And SPE is going to keep bringing you live broadcasts with various hosts and panels and topics in the coming weeks. So keep following us and make sure that you don't miss any of this. So we hope that this is a valuable experience while everybody is doing their best working from home. So with that, stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you and goodbye.